The next panel on the impact of AI and ODR follows well upon the keynote. Certainly the application of AI to ODR has grown over the years, often as a result of the use of AI tools that were developed for other purposes and then creatively harnessed for dispute handling. But now we're starting to see a growing interest in embedding AI into platforms and tools that are designed specifically for ODR. And I predict that we're at the beginning of what will be an explosion of AI in ODR, whether it's used in courts, in ADR, or other sectors such as business and government, where people are handling disputes using technology, whether they call it dispute resolution or not. We're fortunate this morning to have 3 experts on this panel who will highlight how AI can impact ODR processes and outcomes. And given the immense power that AI wields and its so often unknown role and impact, this panel's discussion about its potential benefits as well as what we ought to be wary of will prepare us for the following panel that happens later this morning on ODR, AI, and standards. So I'm just going to briefly highlight a couple things about each of our distinguished speakers and give you a sense of what we're going to cover in the next hour. Dr. Karl Branting is Chief Scientist in the Human Language Technology Department of the Mitra Corporation and leads research on applying AI and computational linguistics to improve access to justice for self-represented litigants. Following him, Dr. Hannes Westermann is a researcher of AI and law here at the Cyberjustice Laboratory, and among his areas of focus has been the Justice Bot and the LL Mediator, an online platform that aims to improve public access to justice through AI. By the way, since launching 2 years ago, it has been accessed by over 20,000 users. And Robert Bergman has 60 years of experience in decision sciences, software engineering, business strategy, simulation, defense, scenario planning and systems dynamic modeling, AI and market research. And his next level mediation uses decision analytics and AI to assist and augment mediator skills, optimizing decision processes. So what are we going to cover? Well, they're going to share from their experience as experts in AI how the use of technology for decision-making and improving access to justice can take place through innovation. Karl will offer a high-level look at AI, large language models, and generative AI, and he's also going to provide some recommendations on their relationship with and applicability to ODR. Hannes will give us a demonstration of LL Mediator, which assists with message reformulation for users and mediators and has the option to intervene autonomously. He will also highlight attending benefits and risks, and Bob will provide us with an introduction to next-level mediation, highlighting the integration of AI tools and the benefits for disputants and mediators alike. And we'll close our session then with an opportunity to have some discussion with all of you and with each other about the presentations. So with that, I will now hand it over to Karl.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you to the organizers of this forum for inviting me to present here. As Leah suggests, I'm going to try to do a survey kind of one notch lower in generality than what we just got from Laurent. So I'm going to just briefly talk about AI from sort of an engineering point of view, take an AI perspective on ODR, and in particular, make the case that in integrating AI into ODR systems, it's important to align specific AI capabilities with specific ODR tasks. That's the main theme. Then I'll say something about LLMs, sort of following up on a previous presentation. Okay, so AI, during its lengthy history, has always been subject to fads, which tend to be circulating around whatever technology is advancing most rapidly right now. But I think it's worth being reminded that AI, the discipline as a whole, it subsumes a collection of different capabilities that are sort of human-like, like perceiving, understanding, reasoning, planning, acting, learning. They're all components of objectives of AI. And these various capabilities have different properties. They have different computational requirements and different capabilities in terms of, for example, explanation. So in reasoning, which would be the sort of the fourth row there, if we have theorem proving, for example, theorem provers can provide explanations for what they've done. As our previous speaker pointed out, with computer vision, it's not so easy. That would be that perceiving row. Explanation is quite a challenge there. So there's these distinct capabilities with distinct implementation requirements. And I'd also add that my experience in developing and implementing and deploying AI systems has shown that no AI technology is any more useful than the bottleneck is the human-computer interaction, that the engineering of the usability engineering of an application is essential to its usefulness. So HCI is not AI, it's a kind of empirical study of the use of computers, but it's an essential component of anything that's actually deployed. So I thought I might spend just a couple of minutes talking about using this perspective of AI capabilities as a sort of window onto the components of ODR systems. So there's of course, there's many different ways to break down ODR processes into their constituent subtasks, but here's one. So we can think about the tasks that involved assisting individual litigants, the tasks that involve the actual negotiation process among or between litigants, and finally the case management at the kind of higher level, multiple different cases. And what are the sort of information processing tasks that you might encounter? So starting with assisting litigants, well, there's tasks like eliciting the litigant's objectives. That has to be done implicitly, or if it's not done explicitly, then there's an assumption about what they are. There's explaining potential remedies and benefits, the whole education aspect of ODR systems, and keeping litigants informed of the progression of a case. And from an AI, if we think about this as the corresponding AI task, you could think about this as sort of understanding, plan recognition, or user modeling is the terminology from the intelligent tutoring system. It really is kind of a user modeling problem. Goal-oriented dialogue is the discipline of generating and understanding statements to achieve these goals. For the purpose of facilitating the negotiation, this is things that involve not a single litigant or disputant, but multiple disputants. So there's detecting the stage of the negotiation, there's taking actions that are appropriate to that stage in order to advance its progress. There's finding and articulating solutions that are fair and acceptable to all parties, so that would be smart, subtle, and also Bob's system addresses this at length. There's lots of research there. And then sort of eliciting and implementing the litigant's decisions. So once again, we can kind of think of this as being a kind of understanding. It's not user modeling at this point. It's a sort of discourse analysis problem of what's the stage of this negotiation, what's going on, what's the impasse, what's stopping things from moving forward. There's the actions, taking actions like generating text or to advance the dialogue. That's the negotiation. That's once again sort of a goal-oriented dialogue thing. This is finding and generating the compromise. Well, of course, there's a decision theory, a negotiation theory. There's a vast theory here that's just that component. And finally, finding out what the decisions are is sort of a goal-directed dialogue. So I put in a plug for my own recent work, which was to do a model of this component, facilitating the detecting the stage of the negotiation and acting appropriately. And Hannes is going to talk about actually a sort of a large language model approach to this work, which was done with the older sort of pre-LLM approach, which involved lots of annotation and machine learning and laborious and painful knowledge engineering. So this kind of third stage at the kind of more global level, monitoring, triage, interacting with the court. Well, some of these things, once again, you could think triage, it looks like a very traditional prediction task. Interacting with the court, there's certainly a document drafting aspect to that. Often it's kind of trivial, but it can be complicated. Okay. So I want to segue on to the large language models, which is the technology of the hour. I sort of won't repeat what Laurent presented so very extremely well, but yeah, LLMs have a remarkable capability for generating fluent and idiomatic text. The reinforcement learning from human feedback is a technique for learning the kind of dialogue component that's on top of that. That actually is sort of the special sauce, because the LLMs is a technology that's at least well published. It's not something you can do in your basement, but you can understand it. But the dialogue component actually is a good bit more proprietary. I think you'll agree with that. But anyway, so the promise, which was just discussed, is that, well, maybe this vast amount of latent knowledge can enable us to finesse this agonizing process of knowledge engineering traditional AI systems. Can we get the benefits without investing all this horrible data acquisition and annotation? But that's a kind of hypothesis. That's what I think the community is working through, kind of the applied AI community. Well, that's what we're working through right now, is what's the answer to that. But right as of October 12, 2023, I'd say that the no free lunch principle is in force, that the price of not having to do knowledge engineering is you have to do prompt engineering, and it's undoubtedly much easier, but we don't know how to do it, or we're learning. And so at this moment, what we can say is that this technology is awesome for dialogue fluency. It is amazing. For things like symbolic reasoning, replicability, privacy, all those other things that were just listed, not so good. So in summary, I would say, so just to kind of to repeat the main kind of engineering message is that as you need to align the needs and tasks of the stakeholders with individual AI capabilities. I think that's the way you have to think about it, is rather than sort of a global stick AI on an ODR system. Number two, always practice user-centered design. Actually that should be in every talk. And number three is use large language models when it's appropriate, but be aware of the limitations. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. So my name is Hannes Westermann, and I will be talking about the LL Mediator, which is a very concrete prototype of a way of using large language models to support ODR. Great. I will start off with a brief introduction, and then I will show you the LL Mediator and explain what it is and discuss some aspects of how it works, and then I'll briefly wrap up the presentation. So just to introduce, and I think we've had those introductions, essentially what I'm going to say here these entire days, and said very well by Karl as well, but of course ODR is a very powerful alternative, as we know, to the judicial system. It can be more efficient, it can be a bit cheaper, it can be less emotional, as people can use it from their home. And often, I think what impressed me yesterday was that often it seems like just negotiation and mediation is sufficient to come to a resolution, which is of course really powerful and allows the building of these cooperative solutions. So in this research, we want to explore if large language models can be used to support the parties and the mediator in arriving at that settlement to further increase the amount of cases that can be settled without directly between the parties or involving a mediator. And so we built this experimental prototype called the L-Mediator, which is kind of a way of exploring the potential of using large language models, in this case GPT-4, in online dispute resolution. The system has 3 features at the moment. So first, it can reformulate user messages to be more kind, more amicable. It can then draft messages for the mediator that they may want to send to the parties. And very experimentally, potentially, it could autonomously intervene in a discussion to guide the parties towards a settlement. So let's see how that looks in this case. The first, as I mentioned, is the way of reformulating user messages. And the purpose here is to maintain the amicable tone of the parties. And so it aims to come in when the parties might say something that upsets the conversation, strike an inflammatory tone, kind of try to nudge them towards maybe saying in a different way that maintains this constructive tone between the 2 parties. And here is what that looks like. So this is the L-Mediator. At its base, it is an interface that allows the chat between 2 parties in this case. It's a prototype, so at the moment there's always 2 parties, Jane and John. And then there are all these added large language model features. So we're here entering a dispute between Jane and John. Jane thinks that John cut down a branch deeply into their property and wants compensation for this. John, on the other hand, disagrees and thinks that the branch was on his side of the property line. So they're discussing, and at some point maybe they come to an impasse, say. They aren't able to, and they get quite upset. So they write things that are angry and might derail the conversation, take it into a more emotional state rather than actually trying to solve the situation. So we can see what happens. Here they're starting the dispute, but Jane now is quite annoyed, and she calls John an idiot, which might not be the best thing in a negotiation stage. So let's see what happens when she tries to send this to John. We can see that the system has detected that the message is angry. It will now try to suggest a way of phrasing that is more neutral. So as you can see, it says, it seems there might have been a misunderstanding. Could you clarify the specifics concerning the property boundaries? So it tries to maintain the context, but phrase it in a very different way. And the user is suggested to this, and they were given the option of either saying, no, I want to say what I said, and sending the original, or they can choose, yeah, that's actually a much better way of phrasing that, or maybe I'll change it a bit, but I'll still send that version to the other party. Here is the prompt used. So we heard before that these large language models use a prompt that tells the model what it should be doing with some data we give it. So in this case, we told it, you are an ODR platform, you are given the chat message of a party, reformulate the message to maintain the content, but make it less confrontational and more encouraging for an amicable settlement. And that's basically the core of what we told it to do. So as you can see, this is not a lot of text, and we don't tell it, we don't train it. This is basically all the data we give the model beforehand. And still based on this, it was able to do this task quite well. It was able to understand the context of the message and reformulate it in a way to maintain that context, but phrase it in a very different way, which is, I think, really impressive, and we'll get back to that as well. And crucially as well, we heard how important the interface and having a human in the loop can be. And I think this is an example of having that, since the message is not sent directly to the other party. Instead, they're given as a suggestion to the user. So they always have the choice to say, no, I don't like this, I'm going to go my own way, or they can say, yeah, that's actually a better way of phrasing that, I will choose to send that. And I think this kind of approach reduces some of the risks associated with these models, since the user always is in control of what will happen in the platform in their name. So the next feature is the drafting of messages for the mediator. And the purpose here is to support the mediator, potentially be more efficient in intervening in these discussions. So let's see how that works. Great. So we see we're still in the same dispute here. Maybe Jane in this case decides, yeah, that's a good way of phrasing it, and she decides to send the message here to the other party. Oops, it's paused. Oops. Okay, so she sends the message, and they continue their discussion. So John is still not happy, and he says, he still disagrees, and essentially there's no progress anymore. So maybe it is time for a mediator to enter this discussion and to try to guide the parties toward towards settlement. So let's see what happens here. Well, we see that John is still not happy and thinks that Jane was not right. So now we see it from the perspective of the mediator. The mediator can also enter the platform, and what they can do is to use this feature to suggest an intervention. And so what happens here is that the system suggests to them what they may want to write to the parties. Let's pause here. Jane, do you perhaps have any documentation or illustrations that might clearly identify the property boundaries? And John, is there any evidence or reason aside from your assertion that led you to believe this branch was on your property? It might be useful to clarify these matters to ensure a clear understanding of the situation before proceeding. It seems decent. Honestly, of course, there might be very different ways of intervening here, but this seems like the system has understood the dispute, understood the specifics, what they're arguing about, and has also understood that it should guide them towards a settlement by trying to, in this case, clarify some of the facts and better understand the dispute between the parties. It's crucially, it doesn't try to push them either way. It just seems to try to guide them towards having a positive discussion between themselves. Mediator can see this, and they can again decide to send this to the parties, or they can decide, no, it's not quite the way I want it to go, I'm going to edit this, or maybe they want to provide some instructions. So what they can do here is to write, okay, this is good, but take it in a slightly different direction. In this case, focus on the importance of neighbor relationships, because they know their neighbors, and maybe they want to highlight that fact to maintain this tone. And if they now press generate, the message will be regenerated, but involving these instructions by the mediator. So we see that it changed, and we see that the mediator asked the parties, or the system suggests, however, could you shift focus to what can be done now to rectify the situation while enhancing your neighborly relationship? So it took that request into account when generating the message suggestions to the mediators. Here's the prompt. You are a mediator. Your goal is to guide the discussion of two parties towards an amicable settlement that is acceptable to both parties. And we also give it the last 10 messages between the parties and the instructions by the mediator. Again, based on the simple prompt, we didn't tell it what specifically to do, we just told it you are a mediator, but it seemed to kind of understand what mediators sometimes do, such as clarifying the fact and highlighting commonalities between the parties. So again, I think quite impressive for this early stage, and also, as we'll talk about, the fact that this is the entire prompt. There was no kind of other data used to train this, and this was all from the general knowledge contained in these large language models. Again, there's the human in the loop. This goes to the mediator, not directly to the parties in this case. So the mediator can control this. They can decide to go with that, and they can decide to choose to change direction. And as we saw, there's a wide variety of interventions. We saw some here, but in general, the system does a good job of clarifying facts, trying to calm down the discussion if it's heated, and even in some cases suggesting some possible solutions. And again, not something we told that this is all stuff it has picked up to understand that mediators tend to do. Okay, so let's move to the final feature of this platform, that is autonomously intervening in the negotiation. And this is, of course, much more experimental. I don't think this is something that you would want to put out there. Well, the other things neither, but this is definitely something that requires a lot of research to make sure that it is safe. But the idea here is that such a system could enable the parties to benefit from mediation in new areas where maybe the value of the dispute is not high enough to warrant mediation, or maybe there aren't enough mediators in such an area. So as we can see here, the way it works is that the parties can ask the system to intervene. This is one way. In the future work, there could be other ways, such as the system detecting if there hasn't been progress for a while, if there's been a break for a while. I know Karl has been working on systems that do just that, and then here the system could come in directly into the discussion with a message. So. Okay. Well, in any case, this is essentially what you saw before, but instead of the mediator being shown the message, in the chat here, they will show up the LL mediator directly, asked by the parties, and they will answer with that message. And here you can see an example of that. So the parties were discussing, then someone requested the LL mediator, and it comes back again. It was the same kind of message you saw before, but instead here it is sent directly to the parties. Now, this is very experimental. This is not something, I think that it is something that requires a lot of research and a lot of validation to make sure that it's safe, and since it is quite high risk. Of course, the user can ignore the messages, and they are told it is an AI in this case, and they can say, no, that doesn't make any sense. But there's, of course, the risk of the user feeling that the platform is against them and stopping to engage with the system. And there could also be the risk of the messages being wrong and guiding the parties, maybe taking the side of either party or guiding them to a resolution that is not fair. But this is very early research, and eventually I think there could be a lot of potential here, and potentially something that could have a big impact on particular kinds of disputes and their ability to use mediation and negotiation. Great, so to briefly wrap up, I think one interesting takeaway here is the power of these large language models. We saw that they can really well, based on quite a simple prompt, reformulate messages and suggest interventions to negotiation. And again, all of this is emergent behavior. We didn't have any examples of how mediators intervene. We didn't have to train it on many examples as you would have done before. But the system just does this based on these relatively simple prompts that you saw. And I think that's very exciting and definitely something, I mean, I think this kind of approach have been really difficult, if not impossible, a year ago, just because of the data and also the sophistication of the model required to even understand the dispute and to understand the specific and intervening. There are, of course, the risk of hallucination here. The models do not always do exactly what they're told. Sometimes they invent fact. And in the paper, what we did notice sometimes, even though we told the model don't take the side of either party, sometimes it would still do it. So this is definitely an early stage. I think the risks are reduced when there is a human in the loop, but it's definitely something to be aware of, that there is still a lot of work to be done here. That said, I do think there's a lot of potential in ODR and access to justice of these kind of models. And I mean, the ease of development here and of doing these very sophisticated and reasoning-bound tasks, I think is really unprecedented, and I'm very excited about the potential to use these in ways that are safe, but also can support individuals in resolving their conflicts. So I showed you the L Mediator, this experimental platform to investigate the use of large language models in ODR. It can reformulate messages and suggest intervention, and I think it is definitely a promising first step here. But there also remains a lot of future work to be done to make sure that it's safe, to see if it can be integrated in other ways in ODR platforms. But that's, I think, a very exciting avenue to pursue. And if you're more interested in this specific research, you can look online for LL Mediator, Google for this, and you will see the paper where we describe a bit more in depth what it does and some of the risks involved with that. Thank you for listening.
All right. Robert Bergman, CEO of Next Level Mediation, actually funder, partial developer. First of all, I want to thank Leah for the introduction and the members of the staff of the forum organizer for inviting me. Are we lose something?
Who's disconnected?
That makes perfect sense, by the way. So.
Non, c'est comme s'il n'était pas produit au power.
Well, while we're trying to get the technology back online, I started Next Level Mediation a few years ago after failing at retirement twice now in my career. So I decided to work on somewhat intractable problems so I wouldn't have to keep retiring, basically, and just keep working on this. And so the focus initially, having some background experience in a variety of technologies as an engineer, as a strategic planner, as a background in decision science. Actually, my first experiences with AI was 1966 as a small bot at MIT called Elijah, which basically tried to mimic a Rogerian psychotherapist, and which, if you understand that therapy, it's that you take every answer, you turn to another question, which face-to-face is really annoying, but it seemed okay in that environment. All right, we're still getting this up. So, and so the important thing, I'll try to go through this within this kind of 10 minutes so we can spend enough time interacting and questioning AI and ODR. But I looked at dispute resolution more holistically rather than just in a civil law situation because there are lots of disputes. And it could be with your neighbor, it could be HR work dispute, it could be obviously a civil dispute or something else, but they seem to have the same characteristics in the sense that someone feels harmed and disputes generate a lot of emotion. Emotion tends to hijack logic, and people seem to regress in this kind of fight or flight mode to what we consider child logic, which is life should be fair, I deserve justice, you should be punished kind of environment, right? And so the whole idea of this system in general was to understand the complexity of disputes and then look at the system of disputes to see where the highest leverage points were that we could interact with tools to try to help the mediator facilitate a reasonable resolution to dispute. And in that context, we defined disputes as essentially a group or decision, a multi-criteria group decision that with participants that had different agendas and possibly were influenced by other things outside of the core key issues of the dispute. Okay, we're still going. Some of this really will need the help of slides, and if we can get them.
Yeah, just a second. Sorry for that, Mr. Bergman.
So. All right, so if we, and of course, it was not just purely wanting to solve a problem, but, of course, we looked at disputes as kind of a growing global industry anyway, and so there was we figured that wouldn't go away anytime soon, but because of I can just use this. Where are we? Okay. So, because of other technologies we've introduced in the previous decades, like social media, we are now working on solving more complex disputes because of the problems social media created. Now we'll introduce AI, we'll solve some problems, create the next set of problems, so we can think in the future what else we'll have to invent to solve the problems we created with introduction of AI. So if we look at disputes, basically what's happened now, because of the internet helping people cloister in their homes, because of things like COVID and other problems, and the effects of social media, we see this kind of reinforcement of people's identities. People now have multiple identities. So basically, They have cultural identities, work identities, religious identities, half a dozen gender identities, whether they're born or found, essentially. And then we have, multiple online digital identities, and people represent themselves different ways and get reinforced by social networking as well. And of course, we'll move pretty rapidly now into the meta space, and now people will focus more on self-branding and, again, become more intractable because not only do they want to solve a dispute, they don't want to ruin their own personal brand in the process. Unfortunately, in 2009, we managed to weaponize the internet by introducing likes and retweets. So what did that do? Well, now it's kind of moved people more towards confirmation bias, because when they post things, unless they get the kinds of likes or retweets what they want, people start to get depressed, causing more kind of mental illness in the process and creating a lot of anxiety. And to make things worse, we have influencers who are not part of any particular set of expertise, but it turns out that 49% now of consumers look for guidance from the influencer, which probably has no expertise in the matter being asked, and whether it's purchasing, travel, dating, disputes, financial investment issues. And according to a study by TIAA, which is kind of been around about 100 years, it's a nonprofit that gives advice in investing, financial investing, things like that. Investors go to these places and ask about investments and actually trust the results they get from asking these questions. So these disputes are getting more complicated. People are more complicated, more divided, and we need better tools to really help resolve the disputes. So, to make things even worse, if you've noticed, there are no classes anywhere in the world that teach people how to make logical decisions. And even at the graduate university level, we're not talking about basic decision making, we're maybe talking about Aristotelian logic or something like that, which doesn't really help. And so people basically learn this skill by trial and error observation, but no one ever teaches them how to make a logical decision. And then, of course, our brains, and we'll look at that anatomically, our brains really can only compare two things at a time with any intensity. And people a lot of times have to make major decisions involving dozens of factors in resolving a dispute, okay, but don't really have any tools to help them make those decisions. And for instance, if you get your prescription from an optometrist, when they try to see what your eyesight's like, they ask you which one's clearer, this one or this one or this one or this one, is because you can only really process two things at any time with any degree of comparison. And so a lot of times, especially with personal decisions, you have to really think about a lot of things at the same time, and then you basically can't integrate all of that in your head because your brain's not designed to do that. And so there's a natural tendency to solve problems by trial and error, and basically now we've introduced, and in a virtual presence environment, it's a different feeling in ODR of presence, because presence is not just about visual cues, it's about smells and stimulation and everything else around you to make you actually feel present in a situation. It's not just seeing things. And so when we are forced to make personal decisions, especially things that might have a long-term outcome, we really need to have tools to help people make that. And what's interesting is it's very difficult for people to make longer term decisions because we tend to be a stranger in our own future. If we try to imagine ourselves 3 years from now, 4 years from now, we really can't do that. And so we tend to make shorter-term decisions, and even though your brain knows better, you'll say, okay, well, I'm going to smoke that cigarette, eat that dessert, max out my credit card, even though your neocortex is going, better think about retirement than your health. You'll still try for that short-term dopamine fix because it's just quickly satisfying. But the result, long-term, might not be that good. And so if you read some of the stuff like Daniel Kahneman, Tversky wrote about noise and thinking fast and slow, you know that people tend to be very noisy and have a hard time working in long-term decision-making. And when we look at the current environment, the human brain anatomically has not changed for 100,000 years, but the amount of information we have to process has increased exponentially. And now there are the normal cognitive limitations, but we have conflicting values, we have multiple choices, we have tons of misinformation or pervasive information that's out there, and lots of different kinds of biases, independent of biases we talked about previously built into some of the AI stuff. But emotional bias, confirmation bias, optimism bias, it's okay to be an optimistic person. It's not necessarily okay to make an optimistic decision because that's a decision more or less based on your ego. It says independent of the probability of success, it's going to work for me. Well, that may or may not be true. And so how do we deal with all this stuff without having tools? So in order to solve the problem, and this is going to be like drinking from a fire hydrant and not trying to get wet, okay, in the process. We took a look at the system of disputes, all right? And here, I don't have a pointer, so this is a little more complicated. But basically, there's a motivation, if someone feels harmed, there's a motivation to win. And that can be driven essentially by human nature, or it can be driven by unrealistic litigation expectations, possibly your attorney's over-positioning. And then, of course, influenced by social media and other forms of things. So as that increases, the sense of injustice on the other side increases, which causes their motivation to win to increase, which feeds back to complete this kind of what we'll call positive feedback loop of emotion. Unfortunately, as the motivation to win goes up, the willingness to settle goes down. And also your ability to make good decisions also decreases because now the biases of emotion and confirmation and things like that kind of set in. So when we looked at the whole system of disputes, we said, okay, where can we interact? Where are the highest leverage points in the system? And there were two big areas. One was understand your real priorities and objectives, both from a disputant's point of view and the mediator's point of view, through that kind of cloud of emotion, at least for some period of time, and then also get a better understanding of the risk of litigation and your expectations of what you might win if you manage to go through the legal process itself, which of course varies by jurisdiction. Now, to get through the cloud of emotion, we take advantage of the fact that you can't be emotional and quantitative at the same time. So for some short period of time, we use some tools to help people become somewhat quantitative about their objectives, and then we utilize that information. Now, so how did we use AI? So the first place was understand the real nature of the dispute. And there we used the AI, and particularly various forms of large language models, to help create questions given the context of the dispute, and also analyze the answers from the parties of the questionnaires to see where there's some commonality or where they might diverge. And that gives you a sense of the nature of the dispute. The second place was litigation risk. This is a fairly common set of tools, but unfortunately, people are not normally trained in how to build these kind of decision trees. Attorneys are really not trained in this area. And so we have a whole library of pre-made decision trees for different kinds of legal situations. And you can modify these or clone them or do what you want with them. But again, those are just to understand what the long-term, implications are of going to court, and if you have overpositioned, it gives you a better understanding of probability of success or what the expected monetary value is of a particular type of litigation. The other tools is the analysis of priorities. And there we use a combination of decision analytics, which gives you a sense or understanding of what your priorities are, because we know the human brain doesn't naturally prioritize anything. For instance, if you're in the bedroom and you want to get something in the kitchen, as you walk, if you see something out of place, you go fix that, and then you go fix something else, and you don't form some perfect route to go get this thing done. It's just the way your brain works. All right, and so by using those tools along with the AI, we can not only stand each side's priority of objectives, give them some actual weights, but also then use the large language models to give some suggestions of how you might resolve the dispute. Again, the focus, as you've heard from other participants, is always keep a human in the loop, which in this case is the mediator. The idea is, and since we divided AI up into assistance, augmentation, and automation, we only focus on assistance and augmentation of the skills in the mediator. We do not do anything automatically. And that is because, as you've heard from previous discussions, a lot of these AI tools, especially large language models, tend to be non-deterministic. And there's no inherent knowledge in these models. And that's what people have to be careful about. If there's any knowledge in a large language model, it's in the subsymbols, okay? It's in the tokens of the language, because what we do to predict the next word, essentially, is we convert tokens into words, words into sentences, and we represent them with numbers called vectors, okay? Vectors are not a new thing. We've used longitude and latitude to represent names of cities for years, so this is not a new concept. But for the large language models, the idea of converting words into numbers is relatively new, and that's what's helping this basically take off. But there's no real knowledge there. And we get confused all the time of what's intelligence. It's not just about what it can tell you if you ask it a question. It's what if it says, this is impossible due to natural laws and this chain of reasoning. It can't do that, okay? So that's why we always have a human in the loop. And in order to maintain ethical principles of mediation that we've kind of agreed on as a group, we need to keep the mediator in the loop. So, just to kind of sum it up, we've divided, and I think you've heard this before, artificial intelligence and large language models into these three areas of assistance, augmentation, and automation. And basically, we want to improve the skills of the mediator, remain neutral, and minimize the risks of large language models, and also maintain the ethics of mediation. And when we did this, we looked at the intersection of the work that was being done on ethics in AI, which some of it's happened at Alan Turing Institute, and some of it's happened at the UN, and we looked at that and the stuff that was done in mediation context. There are risks we've looked at before. There's risks of security, confidentiality. There's bias built into training, and there's always the potential of what people are calling AI drift or stale information. The good news about disputes is people have been arguing about the same stuff for 1,000 years, so it doesn't really matter, okay? We have the same stuff that's out there. The potential benefits, it's helping the mediator resolve disputes a lot more efficiently, and basically, keeping it neutral at the same time. And so that's how we built the platform. There's no time to kind of demonstrate it. It's a large platform. I have a table outside, and I'll demonstrate it to anyone who wants to see how it actually works and how you use it within the context of dispute resolution. And again, it's not just about civil disputes, it's really about workplace or HR, or my neighbor's dog keeps barking kind of dispute. So that's it for me.